guess my first question is actually a bit of feedback as well. The report, it is fair, I think, to characterise the report and perhaps the strategy as a bit patchworky. Patchwork shouldn't be undersold, it can be a good thing. There are a lot of commitments in here and there are a lot of good bits of work. But tying them together is a real challenge, and one thing that I found a bit challenging about going through this was getting context. And I'll give an example. So if you look at point 4.3 there in the report, which is marked as page 16, those using ModGov might have a different experience of this. There are a lot of headlines in that one bullet point, and I looked at this and I thought, mate, that's a formatting nightmare, I wouldn't want to be writing this. If you look all the way down, there's a reference to SC005, okay? And in there, it says on page 17, 92 consultations to date. Brent has a budget for up to 1,000 consultations until the end of next winter. That sounds like a very laudable ambition and achievement, but I have no idea what it means because I've got no context about where those numbers fall or what they compare to. And it takes us back to the point raised in the deputation at the start there about if we're going to be measuring success. If I can't measure success or benchmark within this report as to how good our commitments are or how good progress on those commitments is, it's going to be a real challenge doing that against different boroughs, doing that against our own previous performance and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose that's a bit of a general reflection. So in the future, could we make sure that we're thinking a bit more about how we benchmark and track success before we present these things, whether it's us or to the wider public? I think it's really important for us to think about how we present this. I think Councillor Georgia might have a follow-up to that point, if I'm correct, Chair.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Councillor Minette said. I think that we all agree that the climate emergency, which was declared in this place in 2019, is the biggest issue that we face as a species, and we need to be protecting our planet and doing everything we can. And whilst there are good aspects in this report, I don't think it is as ambitious as it could be. And also, we are many years down the line since that declaration in 2019. So I do echo some of what Sheila said about the need to be more ambitious and the need to plough and get this done. So my question actually relates to how we might compare our successes to other neighbouring boroughs, other boroughs in London, also other boroughs around the country. We know that we're all dealing with the climate emergency in our own ways. It would be good to understand how we compare to other local authorities.
Just, Oliver will come in a sec, but just to say that yes, we can provide that comparison, but I think it also very much depends on our residents. So I've seen, obviously, working with tech, there are councils in inner London and the other side of London are probably doing more. So Waltham Forest has stuff, Hackney has stuff, Islington has stuff. And we've seen previously, back when COVID hit, when we tried to implement things too quickly without bringing residents with us on the journey, what happens. Which is why our focus is to make sure that we listen to residents and we bring them on this journey, we educate them, and they want us to bring the change alongside, because without that it's going to be very difficult to make those changes. So yes, we can give you some benchmarks in the future and do a compare and contrast, but we are very unique borough, so we've got to work to our aims as well in a different way.
I think actually you made a key point, Councillor Sheffield, that every single borough, you might feel there's lots of kind of, it's the same about boroughs, but actually when it comes to the climate emergency, there's massive differences in terms of scale, in terms of where the emissions come from, in terms of the wealth of the borough, the political priorities of a particular region, and it's very difficult to then do a like-for-like comparison because different boroughs have a different need for prioritising different aspects of the agenda. In terms of benchmarks, this is an area of kind of public policy where we do not have a framework, to be absolutely honest with you. Governments swept away in 2010, national government swept away all the local government performance networks. At that time, there were climate indicators for carbon reduction, for climate adaptation, for fuel poverty. That was the first time we actually got some benchmarks in place from 2008 to 2010. That was all swept away. Then we had austerity. All councils pretty much took a backward step on climate change in the decade from 2010 to 20. It was really only the campaign to get councils to declare a climate emergency in 2019 that saw the majority of councils get back into the game. I'm not talking about the outliers like Camden and Islington, which stuck at it during that period. But the upshot of that is that we do not have any objective benchmarking system in place where we could reliably compare one borough to the next, unfortunately. Other than the actual national statistics for carbon emissions, which are provided by government for each local authority, that's the only data that we've got, which is real emissions data.
Councillor Miller.
Without wanting to go in any way into sort of like assigning blame for something like that, because that blame, if it does belong anywhere, it belongs with central government. Let's be honest about it. It doesn't necessarily belong here. But that's quite a stunning admission, in my opinion, and a very bad place for us to be starting from. It is 10 years since the Conservatives first came into government, and you know, we've seen other various wonderful things like banning onshore wind and chasing after fracking and all sorts of other kind of harebrained central government stuff. But I wouldn't want our own agency to get lost in here. We ourselves have the ability to look at some of these things, and we can choose to monitor what we like as well, even if there aren't national programmes in place. And so I think maybe we should explore for a recommendation whether there's work with other councils in London, within our region, to be done on establishing common benchmarking here. And also how visible that is to the local public. A concern that I have with us having a climate plan is that people that are in organised groups like Friends of the Earth will be able to turn up and give their view on what progress is actually measured, and we don't know where that will be yet, do we, which in itself is a problem. But the wider public won't necessarily be able to go straight into those. So I'd also like the council to consider maybe putting in place a climate emergency dashboard or a set of indicators that the public can see how well we're doing on some of these measures, because benchmarking against ourselves is important as well as against other people. I don't think there's any point in starting any project without evaluating that project, feeding back into the project, adapting it and improving it, and without that benchmarking, I'm not really confident that this can be done. Can I move on to my second question, Chair? Would that be okay? Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah, just in response to Councillor Seth, in terms of taking residents on a journey, obviously it's very important to get buy-in from local residents. But, you know, public opinion has shifted on this issue over recent times. It's now regarded as the #1 issue that local people, people in this country want dealt with. So I do think that it's up to the council as well to show leadership and actually understand that sometimes the residents that are the loudest on certain issues aren't necessarily the ones that have the majority view. And I think it's important to understand that and not sort of imply that the residents are sort of holding us back from being ambitious, which is it's sort of what I thought you said.
No, not by all means. I'm just saying we take them on the journey with us. And I think when the council did a consultation, what mattered most to them, climate emergency wasn't high up on that agenda list to residents. But we're not saying we need to make sure that becomes a priority for residents, because like you said, it's one of the biggest issues and crises facing us. So it's about ensuring we take them on the journey and doing stuff where people want them first, but also making sure we also get to the areas where people may not want them, but making them understand the importance of why it's important that those things are going into the areas as well.
It's probably worth making the point as well that certainly giving some assurance around the fact that Brent isn't operating in isolation and that the boroughs across London aren't working in isolation from each other as well, because there are well-established networking groups around this agenda, particularly in the West London sub-region, where Tom, who leads our programme, is one of the West London Climate Officers Group, and they've got a coordinated programme of action that ensures that there is consistency and linkages across the work that we're doing on the ground. And of course, the work that we do around sustainable waste management, an important contributor to the climate programme, is based on a long-standing and well-established collaboration across the West London boroughs, all working to the same objectives.
Just to come back to Councillor Miller's point around the benchmarking against West London and London councils and our own dashboard. So that work has begun. So the London councils have 7 programmes across Pan London, and there's sort of sub-elements to each of those where they're looking at day-to-day benchmarking as much as we can. And then in West London, there's a bit of work that's being led by Hounslow that we're feeding into to try and get a uniform set of proxy measures as a starting point. It's just, I guess, just reflecting what we've said. It's very challenging. It's very challenging.
Tom, I find that very reassuring, and we'll all be paying, I think, not just the people sat around this table, but also the people sat outside in the wider public will be paying very close attention to that. The same is true, Chris, of the coordinating work that's going on between boroughs. It's fantastic that it's happening, but people need to know about it, people need to see it. And it's a lot more visible to those of us that are here, and particularly to people on the opposite side of the fence, than it is perhaps to us members or to the wider public. And we need to do all that we can to make those things transparent on one side and measurable on the other side. Shall I come on to my next question, Joe?
I'm just going to jump in on top of you.
Yeah,
sorry.
jump in. No, go.
But it might be better dealt with by the recommendations. Tom, can I just get some clarity though? Do we have any sense of how much longer it's going to take for those West London frameworks and those dashboards to actually be developed, to be launched?
We couldn't say them in great certainty, but
This is the problem for us as a council, and my secondary point around that would be, and maybe we'll put it as a recommendation to the team, is why isn't Brent leading on this? Why are we relying on other London boroughs to lead, and we're feeding into the work that they're doing? Why aren't we the ones leading the development of these frameworks?
At the time when London councils sought volunteers to lead on the programmes, we did not have the capacity to do it at that time. We were still kind of laying the foundations. We're now in a much better position. We've got an annual commitment from members for £1 million revenue for our core climate service, and we're now able to secure external funding much more successfully. So we're transferring significant sums of money from external pots of funding. And I think we will get into a position very soon now where we will start playing for the leadership role.
can I just add very quickly, is we try to get across in the report that we've been, all of this does take a lot of resource to pull this together. So we're actually grateful for Hounslow to take it on, and we've tried to prioritise taking action on projects and delivery as opposed to getting bogged down in data sets.
Yeah, and I think Councillor Miller highlighted, whilst, we appreciate the idea of delivering projects, Councillor Miller has explained very eloquently about exactly why data sets are still important for us to understand if we're having any impact. And are you sure you want to come? Because we've got a lot of other questions, Oliver. Okay, I'm going to go back to Councillor Miller for his next set of questions.
So with regards to the 2-year delivery plan, how is progress delivered? How is progress that's delivered monitored and reported on? And specifically, how is progress reported to Cabinet? What avenues are there for residents to hold the council to account on delivery?
So the process we've got the 10-year strategy. Initially we had a 1-year delivery plan, but Cabinet agreed that it was more sensible to move to 2-year delivery plans. So we're currently in the first round of a 2-year delivery plan. Part of the advantage of that is that we can be more ambitious with what we're trying to achieve over that 2-year time frame, and it does give us the opportunity to really roll up our sleeves and really get stuck into delivery, whereas a 1-year cycle means that we come back to review too soon. So within that, I think within that 2-year process, we're constantly reviewing everything we're doing. We're reviewing it with a Cabinet member, with Cabinet. We're taking regular reports. So we bring a regular report to this body. We're currently constantly engaging with residents and partners and other authorities to continue. It's a live document. We don't just stick with the initial document and just only deliver that over the 2 years. So in terms of the actual monitoring and reporting, we haven't yet been through that cycle. What we've suggested is that it probably makes sense for us to come to you at some point next winter with pretty much the complete 2-year plan done. Maybe we're kind of 3 months shy of that, so that we can actually start getting a discussion about what's worked best so well, to start building ideas for the next plan, so we can come to Scrutiny both with a looking back and looking forward before going to Cabinet with a similar report for them to adopt the next 2-year plan.
So hypothetically, if I was sat in the Brent of the Earth chair at the moment, and I was thinking, how am I going to make sure that I'm staying up to date with what the council's doing and all of that sort of thing? What's the best way for community groups and residents to make their voice heard and also scrutinise the work that's taking place? I'm very grateful for the opportunities of this committee to do so, and we will be one voice for them. We're very committed to that. But what about kind of their own agency?
So the main channel for trying to engage with all residents in the borough is the Brent Environmental Network. So we send out monthly newsletters which document all the sustainability activity that's happening within the borough at all different levels, you know, council-led schemes, local initiatives. So we've got very good networks in now. So we know we've got a very good handle on what's being delivered, and we're partnering up with lots of all the active groups in the borough so that we do get their stories, we can highlight and showcase what, you know, the great work that they're doing. So we need to get the message out that we want more and more people to join, you know, the borough-wide network. The feedback we've got is that people want to do stuff on a localised level, and that's why we're now moving into creating these networks in the green neighbourhood areas and trying to get a partnership where people are actually helping us to take action, because we need them to take action. It's not just about having a discussion about it, it's about helping us to actually implement, helping them to deliver projects they can deliver, and getting their feedback into ideas that we have so that we can ensure that when we do stuff, they will participate in it.
I mean, that's the important point. This is less about building a platform for interested groups to receive information on progress. This is much more about creating the channels and the opportunities for proper day-to-day involvement and proper participation in the work that we're trying to undertake. So it's about them being involved rather than being recipients of progress reports, if you like.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any supplementaries on any of that or anything. No, okay, I will proceed. This is the bit where I get a bit political, I'm afraid, so that's the downside. The upside is that this is my last question. So I kind of felt when reading through this that it would benefit a bit from being more focused, and parts of me did also wonder about the scope of ambition here. The councils that you mentioned, Councillor Sheff, have had quite a transformative approach towards their entire physical environment. I do very much get the need to take precedence with us, and I suspect that there may be a bit of a north-south split in Brent about how willing people will be to engage with what is essentially going to be a new way of life for us if our species is going to survive and we're going to breathe clean air and all of the rest of it. But the scope of what's needed there and the scale of the threat means that there is a need for challenge as well as for understanding. And if I'm to slightly politically speculate here, I do think that despite the volume of the noise that's kicked up in some of those boroughs around things like LTNs, I'd be very surprised if it ended up in any of those councils being tapped out of office at the next council elections. And so I guess my question is, with things like street design, big controversial things, seem pretty absent from this. If I'm a pedestrian and I walk, you know, over 40 Avenue or whatever, I've got to cross 3 sets of pedestrian lights, and all of the things that are being done in highways and in transport, right, are happening on a day-to-day basis, seemingly without the principles of the climate emergency strategy doing a huge amount to inform them. And it feels like parts of this aren't joined up. It's not just a question of the ambition of what would happen if we started putting in place a pedestrian first principle, for example, when we were doing street design, okay? But it's the fact that we have an active transport strategy that's not very well joined up to this bit in the first place. So there's 2 questions in there. The first is, what can we do to make sure that the principles of this run through other areas of what the council is doing and that it's a bit better integrated? And secondly, at what point, if we're going on a journey, I want to know when we get to the destination, and at what point do we start to challenge the dominance of car culture within the borough, and in particular how difficult it can be to be a pedestrian around Brent?
Councillor Miller says that as a driver.
Do you know what? I drove here, I crossed 40 lane, I did it in a car, it was a lot easier than walking. Give me the structural incentive, I'll be down here.
So just coming in on that, so I think a lot of the councils have mentioned have been working on some of these things much longer than we have. They've had a lot more funding their way as well. Not to say we're not ambitious, we are definitely ambitious, but like I said, we've got to work to our aims in the borough and our residents. Like you mentioned, we do have a very big divide, north and south, so it's difficult tackling that as well. I think the other biggest issue is it's not that they don't work together. The Active Travel and Healthy Neighbourhood Department works very closely with the Climate Emergency Team. I think all the council, different departments work together with the Climate Emergency Team, and they meet on a regular basis.
I would cut you off for a second there, but I mean the strategies and how well the content of these strategies that are coming before the committee work together.
So
not how
just
well the
coming to
teams
that,
do.
the strategies do link in and they do have conversations, but to make major changes on some of our roads, we need the funding for that. So as and when we do have things planned, we do work on it. So right now we're working on the approach by the 5-road junction with Wembley Hill, and that will see it becoming much more easier for residents and pedestrians to walk and cross and cycle around that area. But like I said, it's got to come in a place where we have the funding to do it. So we do apply for LIT funding. As you know, TfL did not have much in the last few years. We're trying to obviously get back to that thing and apply for more and more. But we've got quite a few things coming through, which you'll see. I don't think it's all based in this report, but the health department team does work, and they do look at ways in which we can address stuff like safety with pedestrians, walking and cycling, 20 miles per hour, Vision Zero. All of that is linked very closely with the climate emergency ambitions.
Thank you for that. That's really useful to hear, and we'll keep an eye out for some of those things in the future. And I hope that some of our feedback is useful in considering things going forward as well. And then one quick final thing. Well, we've talked about how difficult from a funding perspective it can be to meet the scope of some of those challenges and to be able to put forward something that ambitious enough that it becomes expensive. It's particularly galling to have this situation when you've got a massive pile of strategic SIL that is very difficult to spend and find projects to spend around the borough, right? So this seems like two things that somehow need bridging, and I'm aware legally it can be really difficult for us to supplement a revenue budget, for example, using something like strategic SIL. But what if some of the things that were our revenue budget were turned into climate projects instead? Would there be a way of leveraging some of our strategic SIL resources into projects like that that might benefit our infrastructure and our climate plans at the same time? Is that something that we could look at a little bit?
We can take that away and look into it and see what options we have.
Councillor Maurice.
Yeah, I want to comment on some of these aspects. The 20 mile an hour specifically, most vehicles on the road today use the internal combustion engine, whether petrol or diesel, and the optimum speed for these cars is about 56 miles an hour. We've known that for years. Now, obviously, that's impractical and dangerous to drive around at that sort of speed in town, but the slower you go, and that includes 20 miles an hour, the more you're going to pollute, because the less miles per gallon you're going to get, the consumption is going to go up. So I can understand you having 20 mile an hour zones outside schools or heavy pedestrian areas, but you don't need it late at night. You don't need it on some of the rural roads that we've got at the moment. So perhaps you need to look at that and maybe have timed, I don't know whether there's legislation to allow, have timed 20 mile an hour zones so that in the middle of the night you can still do 30 miles an hour, which is not going to harm anyone, but say at midday or sort of in the middle of the day, you can only do 20. And I think you need to look at that. The other thing that causes pollution is for pollution unable to disperse. And the more high-rise buildings you have, the more the pollution is enclosed. It cannot get away. And that's another problem. We've been actively promoting high-rise buildings all over the place, which stops these pollutants dispersing through the air. That's my two.